Okay, we are live. Hi, this is William Ramsey. Welcome to William Ramsey Investigates. On today's show, I have a very special guest. He's just published a new book. I think it's coming out on Amazon this week. If you're
Right.
watching this on my three YouTube channels, X or Rumble, you'll see the title and the cover. It is The Great Pretense, a tour through the boneyard of the CIA's war for drugs. So it's not war on drugs, it's war for drugs, which is actually far more accurate if you know recent and past history of the United States. The timing is really exceptional because he writes a lot about the cartels and the border and the trafficking south to north. And we've just had this huge upheaval in Mexico, which looks kind of like a civil war. Doesn't I mean I've seen a lot on my social media. I have a lot of friends actually who were in Puerto Vallarta. Well, social media friends, and a lot of video came forth. So I'm seeing a lot of video and shutdowns and fires and things like that. But Bill has worked as an investigative reporter and editor covering the war on drugs since the 80s, so a long time, following the money, murdered, and injustice in Americans' urban neighborhoods and along the US-Mexico border and beyond. So there's a lot to talk about. Drugs is still an issue. They've changed crack, coke to crack, maybe to fentanyl, and then and meth, and then all of the above. Like it's really an extraordinary story, but he can talk more about that. So Bill Conroy, welcome to the show.
I'm glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. So for people who haven't heard your name, not familiar with your work, not familiar with this book, maybe you can talk about your career, your background, your research, and what led up to the publication of The Great Pretense.
Yeah, I've got about 40 years as a journalist, working mostly either as an editor-in-chief, managing editor, or staff reporter, depending on the location. So I worked mainstream publications to make a paycheck, and a lot of it was business journalism, right? I mean, most of it was. And I moved to San Antonio like in the early 90s, and they moved me around the country in order to get the top editor job. That's how it worked. It was a 40 newspaper weekly business chain. It's like the largest chain in the country, owned by Newhouse family, which is the big East Coast media private entity that owns Vanity Fair and all the big magazines. So basically, I moved around the country, ended up in San Antonio, which is spitting distance from the border in relative terms, a couple hours drive, and you're in Mexico. But it's the first big city you come to, right? Once you cross the Texas border, and so it's a major. And I-10, two major interstates go through it. So there's a lot of activity that comes to San Antonio. So it was natural for me, even covering business, to start running across, the drug world. And I had covered this stuff in years ago. I really started back in the late 80s in Milwaukee when we started an alternative paper. And that's the time the Iran-Contra crack cocaine scandal was emerging. So, I did cover that, and some additional tangents off of it. So that's, and I was covering the inner city there. And that's how I really cut my teeth on understanding how the drug world works, is by going into it and experiencing what was going on. I remember walking in the after hours joints, and walk into the kitchen, there's like a mound of cocaine on the table that they're cutting up to make crack with. And I mean, that's how it worked. There were these after hour houses that only certain people knew where they were. And, they were like party houses, but also major distribution points. And there were like kids guarding the door. They're like 14-year-old kids with shotguns, that kind of thing. This is back in the 80s, when crack was real hot. And most of the people coming in to buy the drugs were white kids from the suburbs. So, and most of the people going to jail, especially for crack and getting really hard time, were black folks, because, the economy of poverty, you could make a lot more money slinging crack on the corner than you could at McDonald's. And there weren't any jobs. I mean, especially back then, unemployment was really high. So I kind of started to look at the drug war as a multifaceted problem that can't be addressed by law enforcement alone. But for whatever reason, there's so much money in doing it that way that since from the 80s forward, we just saw an increasing militarization in our society along the border to where we're at today, where, ICE is a product of the drug war. I mean, they did drug war. That's who I first started covering on the border. Was a major scandal. It was the subject of my first book called Dispatches from the House of Death. And it was about the Juarez cartel and informant at ICE, the famous ICE, was operating there and allowing him to commit murders because they wanted to make a drug case. So there was like 12 people that were murdered and buried in the backyard of this house, and their informant was in charge of the house, in charge of burying the bodies and participated in some of the murders. First murder, he came back, he recorded, and they listened to it, and they told him, well, you go back there, you bury the body, but don't tape record anything else. So they didn't want an evidence trail of what was going on. So, and the corruption, the way they got stuff across the border back, and it still works that way. It is, it isn't like like they've got to use drones or it's corruption. They buy off inspectors on the bridges and they coordinate the loads to bring them through when those inspectors are working. That's how they did it. They had a whole operation that way. And they'd run 3 trucks through, expecting maybe 1 get caught and 2 get through, loaded down with the drug of the day. And they would recruit the drivers, mules. Some of them were U.S. residents or U.S. citizens that were involved right on the border there, but a lot of them were just truck drivers that they were bringing it across in truckloads across the international bridges. This is during the height of NAFTA starting up, and so they'd mix it in with regular commerce. They'd create shell companies that looked like legitimate trucking companies, and it was very difficult, with that much volume of cargo going across the border, to stop it. And ironically, as we were blowing up all these drug boats off the coast of Venezuela and Colombia, in the Caribbean and the Pacific, cocaine seizures actually went up on the border that we supposedly have closed, right? Because cargo is still getting through the border, right? It's not people. And there's 100 different ways. And as soon as we figure some way to stop it, they come up with another way of getting it through. One story I covered, they figured out how to fuse cocaine into acrylic, and they make like lamps or whatever they wanted. They could make form out of this acrylic. And that's how they were smuggling cocaine into the country then. This would have been in the 15 years ago, when I was covered 10, 15 years ago. And it was to the point where the DEA couldn't figure out how to extract the cocaine. They didn't have the formula, so they had they flew up one of the chemists that the cartel was using that they had flipped, to tell them how to extract the cocaine, give them the formula. And before that guy got here, he got murdered, right? So this stuff, this cat and mouse game has been going on for years, and it's basically resulted in huge budgets for law enforcement and for the military, for that reason, for that matter, being deployed against drug cartels. And this strategy that has never worked, and it's not going to work now, is of taking out cartel kingpins. We just took one out in Jalisco. He was already kind of semi-retired, but the way these cartels work is they are not like one entity. There's a command structure that's a coordinating structure, and they have a large security forces, and it is very violent. But there's hundreds of thousands of affinity group cells, if you will, or people associated, whether they're gangs or just drug mules or people. It's a way to make a living for a lot of people in utter poverty in these Latin American nations, and that's why it won't stop until you end the poverty. These people, like one cartel guy I talked to, said, "Look, I'd rather have 5 years of a glorious life than 30 years of misery and despair." So they're willing. They fully recognize what they're getting into, and it's a dangerous game, but there's a lot of money in it. And we keep going after the drugs. The drugs are a renewable resource. We keep going after the kingpins. The kingpins are a renewable resource. What's not so renewable is the money, which we don't really go after. And when we do, the banks involved in the money laundering, including U.S. banks, get a slap on the wrist, maybe fined a quarter's profit, and they've made more than that, allowing money laundering. And nobody goes to jail. So the money keeps flowing. As long as that happens, the drug war keeps going. And as long as there's demand for the drugs here, there will be people that will make money off of serving that demand. So it's a complicated problem, but It's kind of been how I got into this, is just starting out in an inner city neighborhood in a mid-sized U.S. city to understand how it worked on the ground there, and then tracing it, following it like a business. So from the bottom to the top, and everyone benefits in this drug war as long as the drug war doesn't end. That's the way I see it, except for the people dying, right? And that's the price of the game. So there's as long as we have hysteria over this drug war, and we decide the way to do it is to go in and use military or police force to target drug traffickers. And not that we shouldn't be doing that, but if that's our sole strategy, which it seems to be, and we keep pumping money into these law enforcement budgets and the CIA, which is involved, and NSA, which is involved, they really don't have an incentive to end it, do they? Because they just want to make bigger cases and get bigger budgets, and then they go into the private sector and work for a large corporation, and they make more money there. So there's just it's just a sad thing to watch, and it's so hard to explain to people in a short narrative how it works and why it's messed up. And so that's why I write books, because it's the only place I could pull together all my reporting. So I've written 3 books on law enforcement corruption, and much of it intersecting with the drug war. And the first one is Borderline Security, written back in 2004. That's still online at the publication I did a lot of my work for, Narco News. And then 2 years ago, I wrote Dispatches from the House of Death, which I just discussed. And then the latest book is The Great Pretense, which takes a hard look at the intelligence operations that are part of the drug war, particularly the CIA, and how they work or don't work, and the turf wars between CIA and DEA, and the borderline hatred between those agencies at times, because DA makes a case, CIA decides they want that asset or that informant, and they make the case go away. So DA spends a lot of time trying to keep cases out of the sights of the CIA, so the CIA can't mess them up. And the CIA is constantly stealing informants from DEA because they want to use them to gather intelligence or to get leverage on foreign nations, to advance the ever-changing optics of our White House, depending who's in there. And DEA wants to stop the drugs from coming across the border. Well, that's not CIA's priority. If the drugs come through in the service of a bigger national security objective, that's what happens. And so that's the game afoot. It's just not going to end without somebody seriously rethinking U.S. drug policy, both in terms of the preventative side and the demand side. Because the reason this keeps happening, the reason we have so many drugs coming across the border, is because there's a huge demand for it. And until we have better programs there in terms of our addiction control and drug prevention that really work, that aren't like DARE, which is just another propaganda kind of program. I mean, I guess it's good to introduce kids to the dangers, but the irony of DARE, which was really kind of a outshoot of after the murder of Kiki Camarena in Mexico, is that there's plenty of evidence to support that some of the people that murdered Kiki also were CIA assets. All right. So, and that's in the book. I go in the latest book how that worked. So this is, I mean, it's just, sometimes I'm just ready. I'm done. I'm retired. I don't want to think about this stuff anymore. But then it's all around me, right?
Right. But it's cyclical. It's part of our culture. It's part of our world. Like, people get caught up in drugs and families and schools and associates and friends. And it's almost like a Philip K. Dick's. I always think of The Scanner Darkly, where it's just one cyclical, thing that goes on. The drugs get made, people get addicted, then they try to stop it. And then it's just a revolving kind of maelstrom where all the incentives are there to keep it going because the DA gets more budgets, just like you said, or the CIA keeps in power. And so all these people, almost like it's like a weird kind of masquerade dance or something.
Yeah, and I mean, the history, drugs have been a societal issue going, back to the opium wars in China. I mean, they're both in terms of advancing, national, I hate to say it, imperial objectives, and also at times, and in terms of the amount of money that's made in the trade. That's why it's a war for drugs. I mean, it's everybody. Right. If we were really trying to, we have had no success in stopping drugs. So it's just a matter of which faction is getting the upper hand, whether it's in the cartels or whether the DA is getting enough of the drugs, granted they burn the drugs, but, or get rid of them in some other way, but they're still, killing people, even if they are cartel operatives or criminals. There's blood being shed over this stuff every day on both sides of it, on all sides of it. And we really have been fairly tepid about taking a multi-pronged approach to, this whole issue, because you can't solve it without dealing with the demand and the supply side. And we seem very focused on spending billions and billions of dollars on supply side efforts that, don't amount to a hill of beans over the last, since I've been covering it. And that's like,
hasn't stopped anything. It's just somebody else takes their place, right?
Yeah, it's exactly
like you don't learn. It's almost like we're not learning. Like, oh gosh, let's do this over again. It's almost like the definition of insanity.
I think you're right there too. You get a whole new generation of people that don't know the history of it, so it all seems new. It seems like what's happening in Jalisco right now is like I mentioned Civil War. It's really not. I mean, they're burning cars and they burn some convenience stores. It's really kind of rioting, and it will temper down. In fact, in that particular case, the cartel that they took out El Mencho, the head of it, supposedly, it's not going anywhere. It's still there. It's going to be fully operational. There will be people that will try to, chip in, other cartels. Maybe the Sinaloa cartel tries to take a piece of it because they think it's the Jalisco New Generation cartel leader that was taken out. So when there's a power vacuum, there's always a little uncertainty, and also, this guy was close to the people in that area in Guadalajara and in Jalisco. I mean, much like Escobar was loved by the people on the ground. And so that accounts for a lot of what's going on. They're legitimately upset that, and they also see that, U.S. was involved in this. And that's another wrinkle in it, that Mexico has a very long and torrid relationship with the U.S. when it comes to intervention. And whether you think it was good or not, I mean, we sent 19 Navy SEALs down there on February 15th. And the White House and our administration is already admitting we provided, real-time intelligence support for the operation to find this guy. And then you have a big gunfight, and of course he dies in the gunfight. That's happened before, Arturo Beltran Leyva died that way. And
didn't Escobar was some kind of operation too out of the States?
Same with Escobar. Delta Force and CIA and Las Pepes, which was what became the Cali cartel, essentially, rival cartel members. They all worked together to take out Escobar. So there's just so much dark stuff in the story that I look for bright spots, but I don't see much, especially with this approach, because it's the exact approach that was used during the Obama administration, with Felipe Calderon in charge of Mexico and his war on the cartels. And we provided military and intelligence support, embedded special forces with Mexican Marines to go after cartel figures there. And all it did is explode the violence. It would arguably, and most analysts that look at it say it was that approach, the kingpin approach, especially calling out the military in Mexico, because parts of the military are corrupt too. So you end up with, you just end up with a bigger problem than you had to begin with.
Didn't some of those guys, wasn't the Templars or the New Templars, weren't they like created by the U.S. to go after other cartels, and then they just became a cartel themselves, right?
Yeah, we trained like back in the days of the the Zetas
or something like that.
And we trained, because we had the School of Americas, we trained like Guatemala, a lot of Central American special forces, Mexican special forces. So we go down there, we train them, and some of them leave and go work for the cartels, and they bring that military skills, intelligence and skills to the cartels, which has only made them more efficient and more deadly. And, that's why you've seen, and now also we have a flood of U.S. guns, like high caliber guns. There's huge money in the gun trade. You can buy a gun up here, like a handgun, and sell it for 5 times what you paid for it here down in Mexico to the cartels. And so most of the guns the cartels are using are U.S. guns. I mean, guns are basically illegal in Mexico, except for like maybe going rabbit hunting, right? Small gun like that. But yeah, the guns on the ground there, a good share of them are from the U.S. And then the money goes south too, so it has to be laundered through banks. I mean, it and the financial system, and the crypto's used a lot now. So all this expansion of crypto is just opened the floodgates for money laundering for the cartels,
wow.
because it's a very efficient way to launder money anonymously, obviously.
Right.
And then where's that money go? It gets invested in real estate in the U.S. I mean, they own properties in Miami and El Paso. There's, they have family. Many of them have family on this side of the border. It's not like the drug war is, that the border is somehow a differential between
Right.
the
Only
cartel.
on a map, right?
Yeah,
Only
it's
on a
all
map.
one.
Yeah.
It-
A quarter
but
of
it's-
Mexico lives in the United States now. Do you know that?
Yeah, and a million and a half Americans live in
Well, there
Mexico.
you go. Yeah. So it's like the border is a much more vague
It's really a
concept.
zone, right?
Yeah.
That's a Mexican diplomat told me. I was in Mexico. He's talking to me. He says it's a zone. From the point of view of San Antonio, it stretches from Monterey to San Antonio, and everything inside that zone is border culture. It's all connected. Even if you
Right.
draw a line through it, it's still connected.
Yeah. El Paso and Juarez are tied to the hip.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
And you mentioned Bowden in your book. He's probably one of the great writers about the whole borderlands, right? Would
Yeah.
you agree with that?
I totally agree.
Best
I
one.
got to know Chuck. He was I do explain the relationship with him in the book, and he was
And Webb too. So mention Bowden and
Gary,
Webb. Yeah, people
yeah.
don't. Webb is still around. They just this whole thing with the Epstein files. They got an AI to kind of, or this Ian Carroll's his name, but he put together an AI to analyze the files. He named it after Gary Webb, so it's called Webb IO.io. Anyway, so
Yeah.
please continue about Bowden. People may not
Yeah.
know his name. Very important figure.
Yeah, I mean, the way I got connected with Chuck, I call him Chuck, was the drug war, and when Gary Webb died, and that's another story how I got to know Gary. But Gary died, and I remember that Gary had told me, the one person he would trust with his life was Charles Bowden, and I knew Charles just from his writing. I'd never interacted with him before, but I wrote a story about Gary Webb, and when he died, and I called Chuck, and and that's when I first started talking to Chuck about the drug war and about Gary, and got to know his history with Gary, and we continued corresponding for years on the drug war. We shared notes. He'd give me tips, leads. I mean, he had a far deeper reservoir of sources and understanding of the border than I did. So in many ways, he was a mentor to me. And he opened my eyes to a lot of things I probably would not have seen had he not kind of, traversed that ground and
He was a very hard-working journalist. I think he put out like 40 articles and books, and
yeah, he's a great
very
writer.
fastidious. Yeah,
he's a great writer, and he's a great reporter. He got it right, but he also had a way of, I remember having a conversation for him, and he said he was some of this effect that he was lucky that he was able to write what people were thinking. In other words, he could put into words what was already in people's minds and hearts. And that he recognized that was a gift that he had. And so, and all great writers, that is really what they do. They're not creating something from whole cloth. They just have a way of kind of tapping into the subconscious and the consciousness of people, and putting into words what people are already experiencing, or already intuitively understand, but maybe don't quite have the words to put around it. And that was a great gift he had. And he wrote a number of books in the drug war. He's also very much an environmentalist and wrote a lot about the border environment and the desert and so forth. But
and wrote "Kill the Messenger," right? That turned it into a movie, right?
That was Gary Webb's. The movie was about Gary.
The movie
Webb.
was about Webb, but I think he wrote a book called "Kill the Messenger," and that was the name of the movie. I could be wrong.
Yeah, I don't know if he wrote that particular book. That was another another
By
guy I
Nick
know.
Shue. Nick Shue
Yeah,
did it.
yeah, and I know
He
Nick
wrote the
too.
preface. I'm sorry, excuse me.
Yeah, yeah, that's right. And Nick was is a great journalist too. But the thing is, it's a kind of a small world. The people that, especially back then, I'm talking 2004 to 2010 is
Yeah,
when it
that's
was
when Webb
really
died. Webb died is 2004.
2004. Yeah, but it was kind of a small world in the U.S. anyway. People that really covered the drug war. A lot of it was like helicopter journalism. Or embassy, strapped journalism where they go out embedded with the Mexican military, or they'd helicopter in for 3 days and try to write about it. I mean, there was a whole group of us that actually lived on the border that were covering this stuff. Chuck, Gary was out of the picture too soon, but he was covering obviously the Central American stuff and Iran Contra, and then there were a number of other journalists that we would talk because we'd compare notes. It was a kind of a close knit group, doc filmmakers, journalists, some artists down there that were working on it. So that period was kind of cool, as much as it was scary and violent. I mean, it was cool because we felt we could change the narrative, right? If we actually started writing the truth, and immersing ourselves in what was happening. And I don't think we succeeded because this narrative keeps coming up every time there's a kingpin taken out, and it's just muscle. We have this muscle memory. We've seen it before, but to many people, especially younger people, it's brand new, and it's easy to sell them a lie when it's brand new. I think as you get older, like us, we start to connect more dots, and maybe books are helpful for that. That's why I started writing books. And you got to read a lot of books because it's my point of view. It's Charles' point of view, but at least it's informed by experience. Not
There's a lot of books at narco.news. I don't know if you're affiliated still, but I've had a couple of the earlier guests have their books there. Toby Muse, Kilo, I interviewed him. I've interviewed Narco Saints, that's Wayne Klingman. So I've had a few, I've talked about the subject.
Yeah, and there are good. I mean, I'm not. This is not to say there aren't a lot of good journalists now, for sure, covering it. And but it's for whatever reason, the mainstream narrative on it, particularly the quick hitters that you get off the mainstream press when you have a kingpin taken out, like in Jalisco, is they immediately jump to the like, oh, they're going to attack Americans. We gotta shut everything. It's just not. It's never been the case. They do not go after their customers. I mean, that would be insane. Even if they're being attacked, they still got to move product to raise money. And you don't do that by killing your customers. You don't do it by attacking a superior military force that's going to make your life even worse. So most of this is like, shadow boxing. Okay, you took out our kingpin, it's like the water just flows to the next thing. It flows to the next thing. It keeps going, and you can't kill them with bullets like this. You got to cut off the money. You got to take out the profit motive, and you got to reduce the demand. Those things are probably effective, but and of course, busting loads here and there, it gets some drugs off the street. I'm not going to argue it doesn't, and I wouldn't. I'd say, yeah, do it, but it's not going to end the drug. It's not going to end the problem. It's like whack-a-mole. For every load you bust, there's 2 or 3 that got through.
I remember the crack epidemic. I remember Freeway Ricky Ross. I'm from California. So all this stuff was and Dark Alliance. I actually lived in the Bay Area when that came out in San Jose Mercury. And I remember the kind of wildfire, like, what? These guys are actually making money off the drug trade and funneling it back into Contras and all that stuff. It was really something else. And this is pre-internet, so these young people may take it for granted that you get hard-hitting journalism that shoots straight to you. Back in the day, a lot of these stories would get spiked. You would never even know somebody wrote a story because it would never get through the editor. That's why why Narco News popped up.
No, you're absolutely right, and mostly because it causes more trouble for these papers than it's worth, and they're profit orientated too. I mean, one of the stories I wrote there was a business journal chain I worked with, was in San Antonio, and it was about just to tell you where the real money is. It was a small bank in Roma, Texas, which is near the border. Suddenly, overnight, I think it was like $15 million of deposits came in armored cars from across the border and deposited in this little Roma bank, which was like doubled its deposits overnight. And then not long after that, within, because I go back and read the story, whether it was weeks or months, but that money was, the same amount was wired to a money center bank in New York. And then it was wired from there into some offshore account. And so that's how blatant it was. And in writing that story, I remember talking to the state regulator who had to go down there because they didn't know, they hadn't paid attention to this. Now they had to go down because it had some publicity and investigate it. And the guy told me he's scared. He says, I got to go. I don't, he was scared for his life to go down there and inspect this bank. And then, I don't know if it was related, but it was definitely during the time I was reporting the story, someone, did a drive-by of our newspaper office and shot a couple bullets into the conference room window. No one was there at the time, but I remember the cop, going in, finding a bullet in the ceiling, and it ricocheted up in the bullet hole. So this was like this is like a corporate business journal kind of thing. So it doesn't take too many of those incidents for people to say, well, why don't you, go cover something else? And there's, it's.
Well, didn't they make an example out of Webb? Don't you think like Webb is a textbook example of why journalists would not write about this stuff?
Yeah. They definitely threw Webb under the bus. His story was on the money, and we see more of it since time has passed. How right he was. But some of it was jealousy too, right? It was the LA Times, the New York Times. Back then, the big, papers got their lunch handed to them. They got beat by this little mid-sized daily in San Jose. Plus, Gary was, somewhat of a visionary. He was one of the first to put all of this up on the internet. The internet was relatively new then, right? In the 90s, it was very important to him. They created this whole online, with the documents, his source, the proof of what
you
he was
could
writing.
click through it. I remember that.
It was very innovative at the time. And so that's why it went nationwide, really worldwide, because that was the first, if it had just run in the San Jose Mercury News, maybe it would have been a story there in Northern California for a while, but it probably wouldn't have broken out like it did. So, he was kind of the first internet journalist in many ways, at least.
Right, 1996. So he was really right there at this early inception.
Right. And then, pressure from the CIA, obviously, behind the scenes, but the news, these newspapers all wanted, they just threw him under the bus. They try to pick apart his story and say, try to make, discredit him. They attack the messenger. And how much of that was orchestrated behind the scenes by the CIA that definitely didn't want the operation, or the White House for that matter, because it was run out of the White House, National Security Council. Because they all have contacts in the media. It's like, all these media guys want access to information. If they get cut off from access, that's a problem. Or if they're offered access in exchange for something, there's journalists that'll take that offer. But I think in the case of Webb, it wasn't like an orchestrated conspiracy of any sort. It was just the LA Times, the Washington Post, and the New York Times all just lit into him. And mostly out of professional jealousy. Yeah.
That's
what Gary thought too.
I wouldn't doubt it.
I interviewed his wife.
I think that he also exposed the money flows. Maybe people didn't know, like, you don't know how this is transnational money flows and things like that. Like,
I mean, there were a lot of, he kicked a hornet's nest for sure. And so there were a lot of hornets out to sting him.
And you knew him, right?
I got to know him. How I met Gary, and again, these guys, this is all like, correspondence, right? Email and, occasional phone calls. But because we were, at the time, I was, I was in Texas and he was out in California. But I had done a story completely sort of unrelated to the drug wars about a Chinese, or a U.S. Taiwanese FBI agent who also had at one point worked for the CIA. And the FBI and the CIA under an executive order, can work together overseas, right, or against foreign targets. So he worked for the FBI in coordination with the CIA targeting Chinese intelligence, and he had penetrated. He even went to China. It's very dangerous. But the assignment, what he did is he went in through the criminal gangs, the triads, et cetera, because the nexus for a lot of intelligence for, let's say, CIA, there's other agencies involved, is that drug world. Why? Because if you have an asset who's a narco trafficker who also is paying off politicians in a government, who also has, access to guns for whatever military action you want to take, that's a good asset, right? But that means you got to let that asset continue to operate, which would be, if it's a narco trafficker running drugs. And there's been cases where, like there was the Venezuelan National Guard. Like a lot of these people are corrupt military players inside the government, like they're alleging in Venezuela. And if the CIA can cultivate them as assets, then they kind of get carte blanche. I mean, a good example, probably the best recorded example, was in Panama, Noriega. Noriega was a CIA asset. I talked to a guy who was bringing him payoffs, but the problem is he got too far outside his lane for the CIA's comfort, and they burned him because he was too much more, became more liability than asset. But for the longest time, he was helping to coordinate the drug shipments that were being used to fund buy the arms to get to the Contras. He was part of that cog in that era, and that still goes on. And we have assets. My book gets into other cases that are probably not well known, where we cultivated major narco trafficker players, whether they were communication specialists or actually organizational wizards in the narco world, as assets, CIA assets that ended up working diametrically opposed to cases being built by DEA, and informants were murdered. They suddenly stuff's leaked out of the embassy identifying informants, and it was a mess. I don't understand if people understood how crazy it was.
Yeah, it's totally crazy. It's totally Byzantine. They say that David Ferry and Barry Seal were both CIA assets.
Yeah,
and here they are, like running drugs and guns and just crazy stuff.
They do.
Like what?
They had a whole cadre of.
Can't believe it.
Yeah, and so.
Barry Seal's another story. I think he's early 90s, but he was like, Mena and bringing stuff up from the South. And
yeah. And it depends what they're working on, whether they get, if they're cultivated as an asset, depending for which agency. I mean, even the ICE asset that I talked about in the House of Death case was busted by DEA, or by actually in New Mexico, bringing a load of dope across the border without the permission of ICE or DEA when he was working as their informant. DEA deactivated him right away. ICE actually got his case dismissed and continued working with him. So this is how it works, right? Like the informant world is until you can get your arms around how we use informants and assets, you really can't understand how messed up the drug war is, and for both how dangerous and why it's so dangerous.
Why is it even a war? Why do we even have a war?
What is it? It's, I don't know.
That's even the thing. It's like an undeclared civilizational war on. I mean, what if you decriminalized everything and then just dealt with it as a sociological issue? It would be completely different. There wouldn't be as many deaths. And
I think the approach of decriminalization, it's worked for marijuana. Marijuana is now not the major. I mean, but what happens is they move to other drugs and so forth. So I think fentanyl is no game. I mean, there's no way that should be out in circulation in the general population. It's just not that. So we got to figure out a system where, decriminalize stuff that we can handle.
Have you ever heard of the study? Have you ever heard of the study in Netherlands where they decriminalized everything and drug usage didn't go up? They just kept giving it to foreigners who had criminal, regulations in their own countries who would go to Netherlands. But the Netherlands, it didn't change anything. So
and it's true. Portugal experimented with it. For that matter, Seattle is experimented with basically.
How's that going?
It did. Like I said, it works fine. Marijuana is it's a huge business. It's regulated. and it's, there's still a gray market or a black market for weed, but it's greatly diminished because it's so easily available, and the prices are really kind of affordable, to be honest with you. But where it doesn't work so well is when you get into stuff like fentanyl and heroin. You can work with heroin for people, but that's addiction stuff. That's where you got to work on addiction and addiction control and getting our programs suck. They do. They're more punitive than real. There's some that are good, right? But as a national drug policy, we aren't focused on harm reduction. We're focused on, increasing the harm to those who are in any way, even if they're, casual recreational users. So yeah, we need somebody who has some smarts, probably more than one person, who can design both a national program and an approach internationally to deal with the bad actors. I think the better way to deal with the bad actors internationally is going after the money, and the better way to deal with the supply or the demand issue here in the United States is to really put make it a healthcare issue, like you said.
Right. Yeah.
And
Shift it up.
Yeah, and then realize that you're still at the end of it, you're still going to have people that probably would be violent if it wasn't for drugs, right? There's just a certain percentage of the population that's
violent. Yeah.
Some of them are maybe in office now, but they just have.
They might be.
Yeah, I mean, so you're not going to ever get rid of all. I don't believe you get rid.
I don't know. Humanity's never gotten rid of crime, so. Right. It just doesn't happen. It's endemic in the human society.
You can reduce the harm for sure, and work. But we've really never, had a concerted effort to do that inside the United States. There's just a hodgepodge of programs, but the money isn't there. The money's in Plan Colombia and Plan Mexico now. The new security operation. Billions of dollars are given to foreign militaries and foreign police forces that are racked with corruption, and then the same on the U.S. side. And it's so tempting. Most of the border patrol folks, right? They're from that area. They're making crap money, like in a really hard job, or the ones working on the bridges that are inspectors. They can make as much in a week, work winking and nodding, letting loads through or letting people through as they would in a year at Border Patrol. And once they're bought off, they're stuck, right? Because they got them, right? They got to keep working for them, or they get, they end up getting
Plomo or Plata, isn't that it? Something like that.
Yeah. Well, they don't necessarily. I mean, they use the same techniques that intelligence agencies do. One story, I remember they recruited an inspector on the bridge in Juarez by getting a woman from in El Paso, by getting some woman from Juarez that worked for the cartels to become his lover, and sucked him in that way. And then he took, it's like a little bit at a time. You do one, just do this once, It's just once you're in, you can't get out. And so that, and then once that happens, there's like nobody wants the corruption on their watch. So it's hard to root out the corruption inside our law enforcement, because then it hurts their budgets, makes them look bad, et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
So our oversight, and it's been completely dismantled now in this administration, but it was bad to begin with.
Right.
Lax oversight.
Now it's their war on cartels, right? I mean, this is it.
Yeah. So that's kind of the, like the big picture. But to get back to Gary, so I was covering this story on this FBI spy on China, and it all came out in the court records, right? And that's what I was writing from, the court records. And then after the story ran in my weekly print publication and online at the time, I was made aware that the DOJ had filed a motion in Sacramento where Locke Lau had filed his lawsuit. It was a workplace hostile discrimination case where all this came out, an innocuous case, but all this explosive information came out. They filed a motion to retroactively seal the documents, the court documents I had used for the story, and to seize any computer that had the court documents on it, which was my computer. So I knew they were coming after me. And that's how I met Gary. I knew the guy that started Narco News, El Giordano, and I knew about Gary's work. And Gary at the time was working with Narco News. He was for a short period the editor of Narco News. So I
Is
contacted
El
him personally.
Giordano still around?
He died.
passed away?
Died in July 2023.
Oh, sorry.
Cancer. Yeah.
Sorry about
Yeah. And anyway, so Gary said the judge hasn't ruled on this. Get those documents out. In fact, send them to me and I'll get them out for you. And I did. And he worked with the First Amendment Coalition in California, and they had it all up on the web. And it's still up, the documents that they were trying to seal. Remember, they were public records for weeks until I ran my story. Then they wanted to put the genie back in the bottle. And so the judge never issued the order. He said, I can order that the records be, that are in the courthouse be sealed, but I can't do anything about the stuff that's already out there. And so he never issued the order. And from that point on, then Gary took up the cudgel. I was taken off the story. I was told not to do any more investigative reporting, to your point earlier, by my newspaper because of the risk, because they take the computer, they shut down the newspaper, right? So it was a real risk. I understand where they were coming from, but it isn't really helping journalism either, right? If you are that easily intimidated. But Gary took it up, and he delved deeper into the story and did a big. It was one of the last stories he wrote on this case. He wrote for the Asian Times and later for the Sacramento alternative paper. There was a story that
He basically got kicked out. I mean, he had to really scrap for jobs.
He did. I tried to help him. Chuck tried to help him, and like the case of the San Antonio Express News, he actually applied there. They didn't even return his call. They didn't even get back to him, and this was like the best investigative print journalist in the country at the time. And he couldn't find a job anywhere. And then I remember Chuck telling me, a great quote from him, but so true. I keep it to this day. He says, that tells me all I need to know about this business I'm in. You can collect a paycheck every 2 weeks as long as you don't draw blood.
Right. It's rough, man. It's pretty rough. It's very competitive too. Like you talk about professional jealousy and stuff. People are rough. Like I've come out of law where it's like piracy, man. They have the morals of like a moral leper is like probably like a saint in legal thing. But journalism isn't that much better, man. They'll steal the stuff, stories, and take credit and not give you credit. There's all kinds of stuff like that. Like it really does happen. So
it all becomes inside baseball, and people on the outside, kind of look at it that way. But you're absolutely right, and that is a big factor. What happened to Gary is that professional jealousy, really.
Yeah, jealousy, right? I mean, it's like that in anything, whether it's even entertainment, sports.
Yeah, it's human nature.
It's human nature. Bill, do you have time for a few questions? We're at the 50-minute mark. Local Squatch asks, made the statement earlier today that the government doesn't even need our taxes. They could still be in business with all the money they make drug dealing. Do you think that the amount of money they're making drug dealing would cover like a lot of our national budget?
Well, I have a little different take on how I don't think the government is. There are corrupt agents, and that stuff does happen, right? But generally, it's just our point of view or motivation in the drug war is seizing the drugs, right, and then getting big headlines and getting bigger budgets. So the tax dollars are coming from us to fund these bloated law enforcement budgets, and they need to get stats to justify the budget. So that's their motivation. The CIA, there are black ops that will, like that happened in Vietnam, and I know what happened in Latin America. It definitely happened with Iran-Contra, where they'll allow drugs into the country, or even cutouts or assets that are not, they're one step downstream from them, to sell drugs to raise money to buy the guns. But it's always not. It's not about the money in those cases so much as causing some geopolitical outcome, such as getting guns to the Contras so they can overthrow the Nicaraguan government in that era, or in the case of Venezuela, using assets there. Who knows what drug boats they're blowing up? But my bigger question is, which ones are getting through, and is there a design to that? Are they helping one cartel to hurt another cartel? We saw that happen with the battle between the Juarez cartel and the Sinaloa cartel, where the Sinaloa cartel was basically set up to wipe out the other cartels, just like our Afghanistan strategy with the the tribes over there. And then once the Sinaloa cartel had domination, which they did get, then we go after and take down the Sinaloa cartel. But these deals that are made to happen, make this all happen, is allowing drugs into the country because you have to work with one cartel to get the other cartel. So that cartel, basically, you look the other way because you need their help. So that's the way I see it happening. It's not that there's a big like government-sponsored drug running operation. There are many corrupt operations within law enforcement that result in that, and there are just bad, idiotic, clueless strategy and planning, arrogance mostly. They think all these brown people south of the border are just too stupid, and the fact is they've been handing us our lunch for decades.
Somebody asked you a question. It's about Iran-Contra. It may not be totally on point, but in the 80s, F4 and F-14 parts were smuggled to Iran. Trade persisted even after 9/11. Mossad probably why. Do you have any thoughts on that? Do you know about that?
Now, which was that again? This is the trade.
It's about Iran-Contra. It's an Iran-Contra question.
Yeah, I mean, on the missile side, that whole thing, that was kind of a separate operation as I saw it. I think it was all linked because Ollie North was involved, but he was, they were trying to get the hostages back for the election, right? But they also wanted, big thing with Nicaragua is, and it still is today, so I can only really speak to that side of it. Is we have had an ongoing policy of replacing or forcing out leftist leaders in Latin America, going back to the dirty wars in El Salvador, which, was the era of Iran-Contra. And that continues today. We want to drive out, the Venezuelan, even though we left them in place, the socialist regime. Colombia has been a target because of its leftist policies. Argentina is our friend because they have a mega-friendly president. Cuba's on our target list. They're next. So this has been the objective of White House after White House and the CIA as a result for since the 80s, and it's not worked, but we keep doing it, and it doesn't make sense to begin with. If we're pro-democracy, then people elect who they elect, and these socialist regimes are subject to the same political pressures as capitalist regimes. If they don't deliver, they'll be voted out, right? Now, when you end up with dictators, like you have in Cuba, definitely the regime in Venezuela, I look at that a little differently. That's more of a polarized society issue, in one group trying to hang on to power at any cost over the other. Not unlike what we're hearing here with the Democrats and MAGA, and what that's shaping up to look like. So I just think that's our policy, and it has been for a long time in Latin America, is to make it look as right wing and capitulating to the U.S. Policy as possible. And that's the way Latin America looks at it. That they just the U.S. wants us under their thumb, and when they bark, we got to jump. And so there's a lot of resentment over that because militarily, yeah, we're dominant, definitely the dominant power in the world, but definitely in the continents here. But culturally and socially, and the way it day-to-day life and the way things really work, our societies are pretty enmeshed, both with immigration from Mexico and us going into Mexico, trade, everything else. So we're kind of at war with ourselves, the way I look at it, and because we can't come to grips with some underlying issues that have long plagued this nation going back to the Civil War, and the idea that this stupid thing called color and race, and it is somehow an arbitrator of justice and good national policy. I do think that's a factor, and I've had people say the house of death, where these people were murdered on the border, the southern border, we're all Mexicans. This is the DA guy saying, he said, if that had happened on the Canadian border, the U.S. government would not allow Canadian citizens, this is before Trump, to be murdered and buried in a backyard by our informants. That would not happen on the Canadian border, but it will happen because it was in El Paso and Juarez, and it was a bunch of Mexicans. No one gave a shit about it, and that sentiment is that's ICE. That people actually said that in ICE. Not everyone. There were good agents. I just want to understand there are good law enforcement. So I wouldn't even be able to tell these stories, but and they have to do it. Some of them can come forward, some can't. But the leadership of these agencies is, particularly now, is whether you agree with that kind of philosophy or not, it's not effective. It doesn't work, and it creates more problems for us.
Yeah, it sure does. Bill, we are at the hour mark. Where can people find the book, The Great Pretense?
It's available on Amazon.com and also through the publisher Trinde Press. Yeah, and if you just Google The Great Pretense and my last name, it should show up, Conroy. And it is available in bookstores, but I'm not certain how that's going to roll out. I know you can ask for it and get it, but I don't know which who goes to bookstores anymore, right? I do, but I mean a lot of people don't.
There's not many left. You can't go if you may not have a choice. You may not find one actually.
Yeah, I know. Like, there's a few around here in Seattle.
But yeah, support your local bookstore. Support there's other online books where you can get books other than Amazon. I say it because it's the easiest.
Yeah, you can get. I mean, it will show up. You can buy it through like Target and Walmart and all that. It's if you Google it, you'll see a range of choices. And then I have a website. I have a website, thegreatpretense.org.
Okay, so you have another one other than the House of Death.
Correct. Yeah.
Okay.
Correct.
Let's see if I can find that.
Thegreatpretense.org, and that'll give you the information you need. But thanks for your time.
Yeah, and you can be contacted at thegreatpretense.com, correct?
Yeah, it's .org though. It's .org.
It's .org. Okay.
Yeah.
Is that the best place? Is that the best place for people to reach out to you?
Probably, because it'll go directly to my email, and that way I don't have to give out my email address per se, which is then I'll just get it junked up more.
Like you even put on a suit and tie for the book cover, man. I'm impressed.
Oh yeah. They had a range of options. They picked that one. I guess there's that I'll leave you with that thought. I mean, I do feel like I lived a double life in a way, with 1 foot in the system, 1 foot out, because covering the drug war and covering corporate business world, it seems like a schizophrenic life. But the longer I did it, the more I realized they're not that far apart. They're just not. It's just one has contracts and law, and if we got rid of our courts and laws, and we'd be back to what the cartels are, which is contracts are enforced by bullets.
Right. They have a contract.
Organized crime. Yeah.
It's just enforcement differently. Again, the guest is Bill Conroy, Conroy, and the full title of his new book is The Great Pretense, a tour through the boneyard of the CIA's war for drugs. It's for drugs. I think that's really accurate. It's really what's played out in real time. So thanks so much for it. Check out his other books too, guys. I brought out the House of Death, houseofdeath.org.
Yeah.
So you can check that out too. I don't know much more about that story, but appreciate your time. Thanks.
All right. I enjoyed talking to you.
Likewise. Stay there.
All right.